It's no exaggeration to say we live in unusual times, but early America had its share of peculiar stories as well, from tragic accounts of intolerance to tales of comedic folly. Colonial history is far from undone. This discussion delves into the oddities of colonial American life, exploring the rigid social structures, political quirks, and challenges faced by those who strayed from societal norms. These lesser-known accounts of colonial life are as unforgettable as they are fascinating. Jamestown, Virginia, stands as the first permanent English settlement in the New World, a feat made possible largely through the determination and resilience of the Jamestown colony brides when the initial settlers, all men, arrived and constructed James Fort in 1607. Their venture was a private corporate enterprise fraught with both promise and peril. However, by the end of their first year, these settlers began lamenting the absence of female companionship in response to the Virginia Company, which dispatched the bride ships in 1619, marketing the New World as a land of opportunity for women while appeasing the men's demands that year. 90 women were carefully chosen to make the journey, with smaller groups following in subsequent years. These women, often referred to as the tobacco brides of Jamestown, akin to the casket girls who later settled in Louisiana, found new freedoms and rights unavailable to them in Europe, contrary to the portrayal often seen in popular culture. Jamestown women had the autonomy to marry whom they chose, and many even owned property, an unthinkable privilege in their homelands. Despite the significant hardships they endured, the women of Jamestown played a crucial role in shaping a society that would lay the groundwork for future generations of colonial women. Like all important guests, women arrived late to the party. The Sky television series Jamestown is only the latest to spread and encourage the false rumor that the women who arrived aboard 2 ships from England to Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619 were bought and paid for by male colonists. Some accounts, including in the Jamestown TV series, make the claim that women were forced to marry whomever paid for them and subjected to disrespect and abuse. None of this is true. The Company of London, which owned and managed the Virginia colony at the time, began a brief recruitment effort in 1618, advertising in England for women to apply for sponsored immigration to the fledgling colony. Men in Virginia were encouraged to help financially sponsor one of the successful applicants. However, neither the women in England nor the men in Virginia were in communication with one another, signed no agreements, and none of the women were required to wed any of the colonial men. In fact, upon arrival at the colony, each woman joined an already established family. This provided her the privacy and security needed as she began her new life, as well as time to get to know the men before making her own decision as to who or if she married. It is important to recognize the professionalism and courtesy extended by the Virginia Company of London in this specific incident, since they could have quite easily forced women to wed the Virginia settlers at the time the world saw women as property, and the numerous instances of women kidnapped and sold to Virginia show that they probably could have done it without much hassle. While it is definitely true that a shortage of women in the Jamestown colony plagued the young settlement for years, the women who arrived on the bride ships were hardly the first ladies to join. Women began immigrating to Virginia from England in 1608, and a comparably large number of women were aboard the 5-ship fleet of the famous Third Supply of that same year. One woman in bars married carpenter John Leyden 3 months after she landed in Jamestown, becoming the first marriage in the colony. The owners of the Virginia Company, as well as the early colonial leaders, believed more permanent female settlers would encourage social and cultural stability in the colony. Men would be more likely to stay in Virginia if they had a wife and family. Let's face it, recruiting anyone at all to leave hearth and home for the wilds of Virginia proved a hard sell. At the same time, the Virginia Company promoted their colonial venture. People returned from Jamestown to report life in the New World was a complete nightmare. The decision to cross the Atlantic only to deal with a strange land with unfamiliar and understandably angry peoples was a little easier for men to make, since society encouraged men to seek adventure and take risks. Furthermore, men, unlike women, required no personal protector to simply exist in the world without being harassed. These facts in mind, immigration to Virginia appealed even less to many women. Even by 1619, few European females existed in Jamestown and the surrounding area. There were a great many American tribal women, of course, but colonial officials frowned on men taking wives among them. Polka hunters who married an Englishman in the early years of the colony stood out as an exception, and yet both officials and the male colonists themselves knew that in order to develop a permanent settlement in the New World, both men and women were needed. Viewed as a powerful civilizing force, women undertook the familial and household tasks men found demeaning. Even though the 1619 brides were free to marry or not, they were treated as the precious commodity that they absolutely were. Once the sale was made, the brides needed to pass a rigorous application process. Shareholders in the Virginia Company knew they needed to sweeten the deal in order to recruit the kinds of women they desired for settlement in their Jamestown colony. Socially acceptable women from stable backgrounds were highly unlikely to embark for Virginia on a whim. Therefore, an advertisement appeared in London newspapers and was plastered on the walls of buildings asking for women of good family and reputation to apply for resettlement in Virginia. As the idea was pitched, it became the Christian, specifically the Protestant, thing to do. Save the New World from the Spanish. Papists convert the heathen natives. Also, each and every successful candidate would become mistress of her own household after marriage to a male colonist with her own gardens and grounds to tend. Even today that sounds like a pretty good deal, but in the early 17th century, to an Englishwoman of even moderate means, it had the ring of a brilliant dream come true. Almost all of the land in England was owned by royal or noble persons, and any woman who managed to marry a man who could provide her with a spacious home and gardens was fortunate indeed. Weird dating colonial rituals. In early colonial days, marriage might have little to do with the emotional entanglement of two young people. Emotions were fickle and not to be trusted. Romantic love did not figure in the parents' equations, and it was not until about the middle of the 18th century, when parental influence began to decline, that the concept of love got serious consideration as a matrimonial prerequisite. Today, love is popularly considered the reason for a marriage, but for the best part of 150 years, colonial marriages among the gentry were arranged in the same way that they are still agreed upon in parts of the world. The higher up the colonial ladder of success and status, the greater was the pressure for the children to marry well. The survival and consolidation of the family's power and prosperity were at stake. Courtship and marriage were arrangements that would be of mutual benefit to the families. Love would have to wait. There were instances when young women and men tried to circumvent the order of the day. But any red-blooded young male who independently set his cap at a particular young lady and approached the parents with a view to instigating a formal courtship was in for a hard slog. Influential relatives had almost complete control of the course of events. The lad had to sit at the negotiating table with the young woman's parents or guardians and show that financially he had what it took to keep his future wife in the style to which she was accustomed. The wealth that he could bring to the table came from his kinsfolk, the ones who could promise money, land, and support. The problem was that a swain eager to start a household of his own often had to wait until his father or guardian saw fit to dispense his property in the son's favor. Sometimes a younger son or daughter could not be betrothed before his or her elder siblings. In such situations, couples had to wait into their late 20s before formally entering the connubial state, which some historians say created fertile ground for extracurricular shenanigans, broken promises, and court battles. For the more unfortunate, if the parents disapproved of their son's choice, they could veto the alliance. The woman's father was expected to provide a dowry. The well-heeled were aware that there were scurrilous and ruthless fortune hunters looking to ensnare wealthy heiresses. Often, negotiations fell apart. For some couples there was heartbreak, for others, resignation. And for a couple determined to buck tradition and marry without the blessing and support of their families, it was a choice between love and money. For the lower end of the social scale, property was not such a problem. There was not much. That made romance less of an ordeal. Since the Middle Ages, it had been accepted in England that a couple could have a common law, in effect, a do-it-yourself marriage arrangement, and as immigrants flowed into the New World, they brought the custom along. The arrangement was a spoken marriage contract, in Latin verba de praesenti, taken alone or before witnesses. For couples that could not secure their family's blessings, this was a consolation. You joined hands and declared that you took each other to be a lawfully wedded spouse and lived together. Henceforth you were man and wife. This short but sweet ritual went by the name handfasting or spousal. Parental permission did not enter the picture. No priest, minister, magistrate, or license was called for, although it was not unusual for blacksmiths to officiate. The anvil becoming a symbol of where long-lasting unions were forged, the ceremony could as easily be performed in a field, a garden, an alehouse, or, as was often the case, in a bedroom. What could be easier, or more open to abuse? It's easy to imagine a libidinous youth promising in a few words to have and to hold in order to secure his wicked way with a young country maiden, later to renege on the deal. Sometimes these affairs ended happily, sometimes not. For young girls, it was prudent to hide a couple of friends in the closet to secretly witness the pledges and forestall backsliding. They could be summoned to give evidence in a breach of promise case if the young suitor was less than honorable and had turned his eye elsewhere. There are in court records countless stories of such skullduggery the spousals that were genuine and well-intentioned. There was often the gift of a bent coin or half a broken silver sixpence to cement the union. The new husband would keep one half, until death did them part, or he did a runner and disappeared. There was a version of the contract called the spousal de futuro, which was something like a modern engagement, a marriage contract to be consummated at a later date. If, as was often the case, the couple jumped the gun and began living together, and the girl became pregnant, the contract automatically was bumped up to a full-blown marriage, and the couple became man and wife in their neighbors' eyes. To colonial communities, pregnancy made the marriage. By the middle of the 18th century, parental control was on the wane. There was a spike in the illegitimacy rate. The old fire and brimstone Puritans like Philip Steuben would have been shaking their heads and assigning blame where they thought it belonged. On dancing. From the top to the bottom of the social scale, dancing featured in colonial courting, as it does today. But there is perhaps another reason for the increased waywardness of the age, the adoption and practice of bundling. If the Puritans thought dancing was bad, bundling must have set their black hats ablaze with fury. Bundling is a word that you will not find in Dr. Spock or any other modern parenting manuals. In the 18th century, bundling was roughly equivalent to a night out with a hot date in a Chevy backseat at a mid-20th century drive-in, except that the cavorting took place at the girl's home and more often than not was encouraged by the parents. It is a subject that intrigues academics, and their conclusions make for interesting reading. It's said that the precedent for bundling came from the biblical story of Ruth and Boaz, in which Ruth, a young widow, and Boaz, a wealthy landowner, spend a night together on a threshing room floor and go on to become husband and wife. Bundling, or bed courting, as it was also known, was introduced to the American colonies by the early flood of Scots, Welsh, and other European immigrants. Doubtless, the cold, damp nights of their northern climes contributed to its popularity. Bundling under the covers panders to a certain Scottish thriftiness toward winter heating bills, as an 18th century ditty confirms. A bishop congratulated the devil for promoting bundling because it was the smartest thing he's done since he put the snake in the garden. For today's parents, the idea of bundling takes some adjustment. Mom and dad may be okay with sleepovers, but bundling adds a dimension. The idea was that if a couple was seriously courting, it should spend a night together in the girl's bed to ensure compatibility. There were ground rules. Underclothes must be kept on at all times, parents would retire to their own bedroom, and there should be no hanky-panky. To that end, the bundling board or the bundling sack might make an appearance. The bundling board was a large plank placed between the two lovers. It has to be said that as a form of contraception it is suspect. The bundling sack was like a double sleeping bag sewn up the middle. Bundling ensured that when, as happened regularly, the young girl became pregnant, there would be witnesses to hold her suitor to account and to make sure that the marriage knot was tied good and proper. These young adults were not saints. Temptation and opportunity yielded the inevitable result. Marriage by a spousal contract or in the church followed. The community accepted the offspring, and life went on in much the same way as it does today. And along came the Virginia Company, guaranteeing the same. Why scrub floors and chamber pots the rest of your life when you can be a gentlewoman in Virginia? The competition was fairly keen. Even a quick perusal of the applications that were discovered in England in recent decades reveals the women did their utmost to showcase themselves, their backgrounds, skills, and intentions. This tells a great deal more about the lack of opportunities in their homeland than any desire to relocate halfway across the world. Some things are ever the same. no matter time or place. The women who applied to become brides to Jamestown knew exactly how to pitch themselves to the Virginia Company depending on their age. According to David R. Ransom's article Wives for Virginia, 1621, the William and Mary Quarterly 481, 3-8, the female applicant ages ranged from 15 to 28. Yes, in 1618, 15 was considered marriageable age. The 28-year-olds actually pushed into old age. Believe it or not, a rundown of their claimed skills is very telling of the value of youth and beauty versus age and experience in the 14 to 16 crowd, boasting of gold and silver lace-making skills while no woman left a record stating her reasons. It may well have been that the youngest ladies knew they would be in highest demand among the Jamestown grooms, which in turn would mean the richest and most powerful men picked first from the youngest, freshest ladies. What other sort of colonist would desire lace-making skills in a wife? Only the very rich, that's who. Why marry a poor farmer who needed a wife he could work to death in house and field when you can marry a member of the Colonial Council, wear silks, and crochet lace? The youngest women knew exactly what they were doing, but what about the women on the other end of the age scale? The 26 to 28-year-old women claimed a wide range of practical skills. The kind of skills actually needed in Virginia Ransom 15. For every perfumed colonial leader desirous of a wife, there existed dozens of small farmers and plantation owners who needed clever, strong women as wives. The older ladies listed, among other skills, brewing, baking, vegetable gardening, sewing, butchering, livestock management, and even light carpentry skills. In the end, looks and youth didn't matter. Every single woman who wanted a husband in her own household settled down with a man of her choice in very short order. The Virginia Company did request that only decent women of good family need apply, but what did they mean by that? Was a woman to know if she qualified? Most importantly, the company wanted to make sure successful applicants were not or had not engaged in the sex trade, which was very common at the time for a variety of social reasons, or had a serious drinking problem. The women also had to provide letters of reference and be known in their community as moral and upright. Historian David Ransom, in his Wives for Virginia, 1621, the William and Mary Quarterly provides details about the women's background and the types of evidence they provided to support their application. Ransom 14 to 15. Naturally, the women sought out only those letter writers whom they knew would produce a glowing letter of recommendations from priests, employers, teachers, and even neighbors. Any of the women who could make any, however tangential, connection to the nobility most definitely included that in her application. Two of the successful applicants claimed kinship to a knight. Others claimed connections to successful merchants, educators, and priests. Ransom 12 to 14. Essentially, the women were all of middling to poor but polite society, who may or may not have padded their credentials. Some brides may have tried to escape the ship before departure. While this is only a theory, it stands to reason that at least some of the women who boarded the ship bound for Virginia became frightened and angry when the discovery was made that none of the supplies promised them were on board. Zug 91 and Anil 234 to 235. In other words, all but two of the women would arrive in Virginia with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Two of the women brought along small bags similar to what we would call a carry-on today. Virginia Company records suggest there was at least some protestation from the women before departure. After the Maduke left port, the Virginia Company wrote a letter to the Colonial Council in Jamestown, knowing full well the ship with the women and no supplies would arrive ahead of the letter, apologizing for not following through with their promise to outfit the women in their new lives. We had no means to put provisions aboard O'Neill 234 to 235. What we do know is that all who boarded arrived in Jamestown 6 weeks later. The question remains: did they stay aboard willingly, and if so, did shame keep them there? What would it have been like to return home after the discovery of such an important promise? All the praise, the celebratory send-offs, the boasting that was undoubtedly done. Who would return home after that? As mentioned earlier in this story, women began arriving in Jamestown early. The first woman, a mistress, Forrest, who came to settle in Virginia with her husband, brought along her maid and Bars, who was courted in fate by all the men of Jamestown and married soon. Thereafter, over the next year, more women arrived, The colony was already begging the Virginia Company to do something about the death of females. The trouble was few people, male or female, wanted to go to Virginia. It was viewed as a dangerous wilderness where people went to die, so the company began rounding up some of the innumerable street people of London and taking on convicted criminals housed in Newgate and the Old Bailey prisons. Transportation to Virginia became a very common method of punishment, a choice to prisoners that proved to be wildly popular over the alternative death. Therefore, most of the female arrivals to Virginia in the earliest years were not the sort of women colonists wished to marry. Indeed, a colonial official wrote to the Virginia Company despairing that the women who were being sent were of such low quality that if the company could do no better, they shouldn't bother at all. Truly, colonials might be second-class citizens with no women around, but even they had standards. Scholars and researchers remain baffled as to exactly why so many new arrivals to Virginia died quickly, sometimes in days, more often weeks or months. If one survived a full year in the New World, one was considered seasoned, barring disease attacks from local tribes or, in the case of women, a difficult childbirth. One could expect to live to a respectable old age, which could range anywhere between 35 and 80. This included the women of the 1619 bride ships. Some survived, thrived, and have living descendants. Today, others faded away within a year or so. At least one of them may have perished in the 1622 Powhatan Uprising, also known as the 1622 Massacre, when members of the Powhatan Nation attacked the English settlements, killing nearly two-thirds of the European population. Colonial women of Virginia established traits of power and expectations in their female descendants. Their rarity gave Virginia women powers they never would have held back home in Europe. They were special, and they knew it. The male colonists shared the same low survival rate as the women, so it was typical for a woman to become a well-off widow before she was out of her teens. Widows wielded great personal and financial power in the American colonies as long as they did not remarry. Even then, the Virginia colonial court record is replete with married women coming before judges on their own, which was against the law of coverture, which made a married woman dead. In other words, even if she was raped. It was a husband or father who sued the rapist for damaging his property in 17th century Virginia. Those rules did not always apply, largely due to how highly women were valued. Not all women wielded self-autonomy, but Virginia women, single, widowed, and married couples, could inherit property and sell property as well as defend themselves in court cases. For the times, that was a very big deal. They were apparently particularly fond of bringing court cases for the most minor of incidents. Virginia women were also notorious for suing their enemies for defamation of character. They certainly knew how to stand up for themselves and seldom hesitated to do so if the opportunity was there. Even 2 centuries later, European visitors to Virginia remarked on how fiercely independent and even spoiled the women of the Old Dominion were. Personal hygiene in the 1700s was wild. Personal hygiene in the 1700s was heavily maintained through a complicated balance of practicality, religious belief, and social position. Men and women living in colonial America washed their bodies and clothes with varying degrees of regularity, often falling victim to disease and disorder as a result, despite the differing attributes of the original colonies. Colonial hygiene in the earlier cities and rural settlements in America always left a lot to be desired, with odorous dirt and waste being inescapable parts of daily life. Middle and upper-class people tried to avoid or mask common nuisances like insects, usually to no avail, while lower classes simply struggled to survive. A lack of hygiene didn't go unnoticed, however, with dirt and grime thought to be indicative of bad manners and sloth. With so many factors to consider, here's a look at what hygiene was like in early colonial times. Full-body baths were uncommon during the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were usually only given to infants, not necessarily to clean them but rather to harden them. Men, women, and children rinsed their faces and hands each morning, but when it came to bathing, there wasn't much more involved. Individuals would use a basin cloth and maybe a sponge, wiping themselves off wherever they could find privacy. Baths could be relatively common, but soap was not used. Another technique was swimming. But dips in a nearby stream or lake were more for cooling off rather than getting clean. Bathtubs reserved only for those who could afford them were often only large enough for sponge baths. Doctors were conflicted on personal hygiene. with some practitioners believing bodily oils and the like were important to maintain health and others believing cleanliness was essential to keep disease and illness away. To compound those attitudes, bathing practices and ideas about cleanliness in colonial America were heavily influenced by religious ideology. Puritans associated a lack of cleanliness with the devil and sin connections that also had social implications. Cleanliness was directly connected to morality, and individuals who bathed were less likely to take part in sin, commit wrongdoings, and be poor. Water was purifying from head to toe, with the filthiness of person engender in the filthiness of mind and clean bodies. Clean clothes, clean households, and clean settlements all contributed to spiritual health. Puritans struggled with the idea of bathing having negative implications for morality. However, public baths, most specifically, were thought to contribute to disease and sexual impropriety, with no real dentists in colonial America. Having a tooth that needed to be pulled meant a visit to the barber surgeon, apothecary, or even the blacksmith to deal with toothaches. Before such an intervention, people used natural remedies like figs and chamomile, alcohol and opium to numb the pain. There was little concern for keeping teeth clean while they were still in one's mouth, although replacing a pulled tooth was common. At times, the extracted tooth would simply be put back into the socket. More commonly, dentures and implants were used. New teeth were taken from poor individuals willing to sell. Their healthy chompers would be shaped to fit, or ivory and metal would be used. The most famous denture wearer of the colonial period, George Washington, wore dentures made out of metal wire and animal teeth. His mouthpiece, however, constantly caused him pain and distorted the shape of his face in colonial America. Members of the middle and upper classes wore powdered wigs. Men and women alike donned wigs made out of human and animal hair. While often keeping their own hair very short, as lice was common, shaving one's head also helped prevent bugs from infesting hair. Wigs themselves were vulnerable to bugs, however, and to keep them clean and presentable, individuals sent them out for regular treatment or had slaves and servants dress them. Ideally, wigs were cared for weekly, but it was a costly process, and people sometimes went weeks or months without getting a proper cleaning. Wigs could be boiled to get rid of lice, and they were often covered in fragrances that repelled bugs. Some common scents included bergamot, bay leaves, and sassafras. Powders and oils also hid the smell of the person and the hair itself, but pads used in style wigs attracted insects that would get stuck in the sticky substance. Colonial households had houses, more accurately a covered hole in the ground near their cabin. When individuals couldn't or didn't visit the house, they could use the chamber pot inside. Chamber pots had to be emptied regularly but were usually just dumped out of a window or near the house. In rural settings, people often lived near water sources. Human waste found its way into streams, rivers, and lakes, contaminating drinking water and spreading disease in urban centers like Philadelphia. However, privy pots excavated in 2014 revealed more than just typical household and human waste. When archaeologists found a dozen brick-lined privy shafts behind what was once an illegal tavern, they unearthed glasses, bottles, bowls, and drinking tankards. Other items included tanning supplies, wig curlers, and pottery made and used by local artisans. According to archaeologist Rebecca Yaman, the human waste was present, but more than anything they found, which dates from right around the Revolutionary War, gave a sense of people drinking and talking politics and arguing. Archaeologists discovered a silver ear picker at the site of the original fort at Jamestown during the 1990s. The instrument, which dates to the early decades of the 17th century, had a pointed pick at one end with a small scooping tool at the other. Ear picks were used as toothpicks to clean out one's fingernails and for a variety of hygienic tasks. The spoon-like side of the ear picker may have been used to remove earwax, but it also proved useful in collecting the valuable material. Of beeswax, earwax was applied to thread to prevent unraveling. Wealthy colonists may have imported fragrance soaps from Europe, but most colonists made their own soap or purchased it locally. Lye soap made from a mixture of animal fat, lye, and ash in colonial America was harsh and used only to clean clothes, dishes, and parts of the home. Lye soap was made with little regard for measuring, and the process itself was time-consuming and smelly. The use of lye soap made doing laundry in colonial America that much more difficult. The harsh concoction combined with hauling water, heating fires, wringing clothes, and hanging items to dry added to the already exhausting task. As a result, only clothes that got the dirtiest underwear and aprons were washed. Dippers were washed with any amount of regularity. The general absence of sanitation in both rural and more heavily populated areas in colonial America meant the spread of disease. Outhouses and privy pots were often close to water sources and living quarters, while streets could be lined with animal waste, garbage, and refuse of all kinds. Common diseases included dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever, ailments that were particularly prevalent during the hot summer months. An outbreak of bloody flux in Boston in 1676 claimed the lives of numerous children in the city, while the leader of Bacon's rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon Jr., suddenly succumbed to the disease that same year. Outbreaks of the waterborne disease broke out over and over again, striking civilians and soldiers alike. When George Washington and his troops camped at Valley Forge in December 1777, nearly two-thirds of Washington's 2,000-troop army perished of dysentery, typhoid, and influenza. The dangers of campaigning during the summer were not lost on military commanders either, although outbreaks of disease may have contributed to colonial success as large numbers of British troops in the South fell victim to fevers of all kinds. Captain John Smith, 1580 to 1631, an explorer, settler, and key figure in the administration of the Jamestown colony, wrote extensively about his impressions of the Americas. He described noisy creatures, notably muskrats and flies, and a certain India bug, called by the Spaniards a cacaro, which, creeping into chests, they eat and defile with their ill-scented dung. He also called ants. Troublesome colonists endured lice as well, with George Washington, 1732 to 1799, commenting that his blanket was full of double its weight of vermin, such as lice, fleas, etc. A young man on an exploratory trip through the Shenandoah Valley in 1748, Washington found himself in a bug-infested cabin. He learned his lesson, however, sleeping outside and close to the fire on future outings. Christian missionary George Henry Lascelles had a bigger problem with bugs, a troublesome plague to both man and beast called living ashes. Natives gave them the name because, according to Lascelles, their bites were as painful as the burning of red-hot ashes. The earliest European settlers in North America didn't shave, with smooth, hair-free faces becoming common only during the mid-18th century. Men, on the other hand, visited barbers. When they wanted a shave carried out with straight razors, shaves were done by skilled barbers. To be a barber was considered a lowly profession. However, in large part due to its racial implications, many slaves shaved their masters while free non-whites worked as barbers in a society in which white labor was considered too valuable for the task. There's very little evidence to suggest that women shaved any part of their bodies, especially since conventions dictated women show no significant amount of skin. Even hair on a woman's face wasn't shaved in part. Because shaving was dangerous and bloodbaths could only be prevented by experienced hands, women may have plucked hairs or used depilatory creams instead of several recipes in medical handbooks that circulated in England and the colonies. Specifically, The Birth of Mankind, 1540, included recipes for depilatories that combined limestone, arsenic, and other substances during the Revolutionary War. George Washington made it clear that sanitation and cleanliness were essential to health and service, ordering his officers to pay attention should any disease or contagion enter military camps. His main concern at the time was smallpox. He later called for troops to be inoculated against it, but Washington knew that military camps spread disease. Soldiers were supposed to wash their shirts weekly while cleaning their faces and hands daily. Many men ignored these orders in order to maintain camp cleanliness. Followers, as they were known, traveled with the military, cooking and cleaning for the men along the way. Women provided essential services to men who, from one witness's perspective, were not used to doing things of this sort and letting their linen, etc., rot upon their backs rather than being at the trouble of cleaning themselves. Attitude about bathing during the colonial period in America was not uniform, but some of the country's founding fathers were clear in how they viewed the cleanliness of women. Thomas Jefferson, for example, told his daughter Martha that nothing is so disgusting to our sex as a want of cleanliness and delicacy in yours. Doctors in the late 18th century advised women to bathe in large part to cure illnesses that affected female reproductive organs, while Thomas Ewell, a doctor from Virginia, acknowledged the prevailing wisdom that women were so constituted as to become offensive to the nose for the purpose of suppressing too ardent devotion of males to cleanliness was of the higher order. Women may use smell as a means of defense to ensure protection by rendering themselves as disgusting as possible, but the stench was offensive to all women. It's hard to picture indentured servants in America doing the heavy agricultural lifting in the place of slaves, but for a time this practice was the lay of the land in the New World. Very early on in the nation's history, instead of enslaved Africans working fields, it was indentured servants. Transplants from England who exchanged their freedom and labor for passage to the colonies in the hopes of eventually acquiring their own plots of land, tools, and animals. Back then, having land meant you had a means to support yourself, and in order to gain some ground of their very own, poor English folk were willing to exchange their freedom for the opportunity regardless of how they were treated as indentured servants. There was plenty of land to go around in the New World, which meant that those who jumped on the bandwagon quickly enough could have at least a shot at a decent life. Of course, what constituted a good life for a freed indentured servant was a far cry from the lifestyles of the colonial elite, the slave and indentured servant owners, who ate the most disgusting, decadent colonial foods you can imagine as just one part of their lavish ways of living. The problem was that sometimes the trouble of obtaining that land meant becoming someone else's property, at least for a time, and of course, unlike slaves, indentured servants could eventually earn their freedom, which is one of the reasons why they became less popular over the years. Many immigrants viewed indentured servitude in colonial America as a way to establish themselves in a new country, but the arrangement didn't always work out as planned in reality. Indentured servitude in England, the forefather of indentured servitude in the United States, has a long history that goes all the way back to the days of medieval serfdom. When the lower working classes functioned as bound tenant farmers on the lands of the landed elite, legislatively the practice also has a robust history in that country. In 1349, for example, an ordinance known as the Ordinance of Laborers declared that any man or woman under the age of 60 who wasn't a tradesperson with a particular craft was required to serve someone with their labor. The law, which was updated in both 1495 and 1563, essentially attempted to reduce the number of the unemployed and those living in poverty by forcing them into a livelihood. In addition, the law was still in effect when Jamestown was founded, and it would play a role in indentured servitude in the New World as well. Indentured servitude made its way to colonial America in the early 1600s. Why? Because at the time the colonies didn't have the infrastructure they would eventually have in the 1700s, and they needed to build it. The Virginia Company of London finished construction of Jamestown in 1607, and they really needed people to help get the town and much of the surrounding area on its feet. The way to do that was cheap labor, shipping people over who couldn't afford to ship themselves. Thus, indentured servants came into play. Boat travel during the early days of the colonies was neither cheap nor safe. Many people died during the passage over the Atlantic, and those that survived found themselves with hefty travel bills to pay back for the wealthy. Travel wasn't exactly a problem, but for those who did incur a debt, the Virginia Company set up a system of indentured servitude that enabled them to pay back whatever they owed by working it off. This travel for labor exchange system ended up becoming the foundation of the New World's economy. Slaves certainly existed in the early days of the colonies, but they actually weren't as widely used as indentured servants for a time. The reason for this was that the servants came with a great deal of benefits for each servant a master sponsored across the Atlantic. They were given 50 acres of land by the British government, since taking on indentured servants from the homeland helped deal with the overpopulation and poverty problems there. Those benefits greatly exceeded the cost of feeding a servant and paying their way across the sea, so plantation owners embraced the system as a way to substantially increase their land holdings. Not only did they get more land, but they also got someone to work on it. For them, when an indentured servant had their fare across the Atlantic paid, they signed a contract that led to them working for their benefactor as a servant for a certain number of years. That number would be anything from 4 to 7 years, with an average of 5 years. During that time, the servant was seen as their master's personal property through the contract. That contract could be inherited should the owner die, and it could also be sold between masters. The price would be determined by the skills the servant possessed. Servants were given food, clothing, and shelter during their stay with their masters. Some particularly generous masters even gave them a salary during their time working, assuming they survived. The servant was also paid something called freedom dues or a freedom home package. These usually included stuff like land, corn, new clothing, and tools, giving them the basics they would need to make a modest living. They were also allowed to leave the plantation for good. Indentured servants were not treated as badly as slaves. While they were technically considered property and worked hard, they still had some freedom. As long as they fulfilled their work obligations, they were allowed to leave the plantation with their master's permission. Unfortunately, they were not allowed to get married or have children. Anyone who did faced severe punishment. Working on a plantation was difficult work. Many indentured servants were overworked, and when they were even remotely insubordinate, they were beaten. This violence, along with disease, led to a high mortality rate among indentured servants. Some masters also sexually assaulted their female servants or beat them to death. In fact, there were instances where some servants organized protests for the way they were treated only to be hanged in response. Once, when the first black Africans were forcefully brought to Virginia in 1619, they weren't treated as slaves per se, as there were no slave laws in place. Therefore, they were made indentured servants and were more or less given the same opportunities as their white counterparts. Unfortunately, over the next few decades, slave laws were passed in the colonies, and black folks saw their freedoms taken away. Indentured servitude became an exclusive opportunity for white people before the practice disappeared altogether. It's no secret that regardless of their relative rights, many indentured servants were severely mistreated. Sometimes that mistreatment was harsh enough for them to go on the run. Since most indentured servants were white and could speak English, they were very difficult to find and capture as they headed north, as they could easily assimilate into a local population if they were captured. However, more years were put onto their contract as punishment, along with any physical punishments their master deemed necessary. At the end of the 16th, the economic model shifted among plantation owners by the passage of an act concerning servants and slaves in 1705. Slavery had become firmly ensconced in colonial society. What happened? Some historians cite Bacon's Rebellion, which brought together white and black indentured servants against their masters, as one of the catalyst moments in the transition to the widespread adoption of slavery. The thinking behind this was that slavery, which specifically targeted black Africans for lifetime servitude, would create a racial wedge between workers, making future rebellions unlikely. In addition to quelling rebellions, the number of English laborers coming to the New World had dropped significantly. By the end of the 17th century, landowners needed a more stable, continuous flow of labor. The legally codified lack of rights and freedoms given to African slaves also contributed to the support for this transition. John Bellington was a passenger on the Mayflower, the ship that carried the first settlers to the New World in 1620. He sailed with his wife, Eleanor, and their 2 sons and was one of the signatories of the first governing document of the colonies, the Mayflower Compact. He was also, by all accounts of the time, a real piece of work after landing. Billington quickly challenged the authority of Captain Miles Standish and was punished for his speeches, which he continued to give anyway. He was then implicated in an uprising against the authority of the Plymouth Church but insisted he was innocent and spared from retaliation. However, the governor of the colony later wrote to one of his opponents, "Bellington still rails against you. He is a knave and so will live and die." Eleanor Bellington was later whipped in the stocks for slandering another colonist. Bellington was tried, convicted, and hanged for murdering a man he believed was his enemy. He waited in the woods, hiding behind a rock, to ambush his rival, who was out on a hunt, leveled his blunderbuss, and fired at close range. It was the first murder trial and first execution in what would later become the United States of America. The ridiculous rise of Lord Timothy Dexter. Timothy Dexter was born into a family of poor farmers in Massachusetts in the mid-1700s. Dexter, though, refused to accept his family station in life and set out to become wealthy and well-respected. He started out as a leather craftsman but made his fortune by using new dollars to purchase heaps of continentals, the pre-independence currency of the 13 colonies, for a fraction of pennies on the dollar. It was an insanely stupid bet that no one with any sense would have made because Continentals had been discontinued and were no longer in use when he bought them. However, when America became independent, the government allowed Continentals to be traded in for 1% of their face value, which was way more than what Dexter paid for them. He made millions on a gamble that allowed him to indulge his fantasies. He called himself a lord, pretended to be a philosopher, and commissioned 40 statues of himself that he placed around his estate. Meanwhile, his aristocratic neighbors gave him horrendous investment advice in an attempt to bankrupt him, but to no avail. He thought the wealthy elite would embrace him now that he had money, but they shunned him as they still saw him as low class. He was once urged to sell coals to Newcastle, an endeavor he then undertook when he brought the coal to the English city, which was internationally known for its supply. The local miners were on strike, so he actually made money. He also staged his own spectacular funeral attended by 3,000 so he could observe the occasion while still among the living to celebrate his death. Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was a member of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the mid-1600s but quickly found herself at odds with the Puritan authorities. She demanded freedom of thought and led women's discussions of the scripture that were contrary to the views of church leadership. This led the colony's Governor John Winthrop to declare her an American Jesuit. Puritans viewed women as inferior, and Hutchinson, a mother of 15, broke with her church because of it. She was arrested on accusations of dissident views as she claimed that heaven was attainable by anyone who prayed to God, not by behaviors and works. She was convicted and banished from the colony. She and her family left Massachusetts to follow the teachings of Roger Williams in Providence, Rhode Island. Then, fearing further oppression, they moved out of reach of the English to the Dutch area of East Chester, New York, where they started their own government that called for the separation of church and state as well as trial by jury. She was massacred by Native Americans in 1643. Judy de Mons was born into a family of Portuguese conversos in 1683. Conversos were Jewish people who practiced Christianity publicly during the Inquisition but remained Jews in private. This heritage makes his destiny all the more intriguing. He became the first Jew to receive a degree in the colonies and also the first to teach at Harvard, but he had to convert to Christianity in order to do it after studies in Europe. He set up a shop in New York where he taught Hebrew to both Jews and Christians and led theological discussions on the Jewish mystical teachings of the Kabbalah. He moved to Massachusetts and got his master's at Harvard in 1720. As biblical students were required to read the sacred texts in their original language. The college also needed a Hebrew professor, hence his appointment. However, Harvard required all professors to be practicing Christians. It put him in a quandary: convert to Christianity after he spent his whole life promoting the teachings of Judaism, or give up on his dream. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 was an uprising that took place in the British colony of South Carolina. Led by 20 slaves, it was an attempt to escape to Florida, where the Spanish had promised freedom and land to slaves who fled the British. Margaret Washington of Cornell University speculates on Jimmy, the rebellion's leader. He may have come from a leadership family in Africa. He had some skills, some cultural skills that were European, but at the same time, his sense of himself, his sense of identity, and his sense of his community were African. The Stono Rebellion was the first slave revolt documented in the South. Some believed other slave uprisings were inspired by Stono. Others, however, say the slaves were reacting independently to the same harsh conditions that drove Jimmy and his allies to rebel, still in response to the rebellion. South Carolina's legislature quickly enacted the Negro Act in the hopes of disincentivizing slave rebellions. The act penalized and punished masters who abused their slaves since they felt there was a connection between poor treatment and rebellion, as well as a temporary ban on importing slaves. This, however, was because white colonists feared the possibility of a larger African population than European. The ACT also made it illegal for slaves to learn to read or write. In the end he converted, but not without controversy. The community felt betrayed, and the Christians, by the late 1700s, it wasn't punished at all. The number of so-called premature births, around 40% during the colonial era, shows that people were having sex before marriage as early as the Pilgrim days in Plymouth Colony. The Puritans agreed with English law and practice that abortion was legal up to the point of quickening, which they considered the start of life during the colonial era. Most babies were born with the help of midwives, who were much more common than doctors and generally better at assisting childbirth. Midwives also knew how to perform abortions, which were usually done using herbal potions. Abortions by surgery were doubted his sincerity. Sometimes things aren't what they seem, but sometimes they are. Take the case of William Beadle, a resident of Weatherfield, Connecticut, during the Revolutionary War and the early years of American independence, had been a successful merchant but accepted continental dollars even as they depreciated as demanded by the rebel government. Other merchants were not so patriotic and disobeyed the law to their financial advantage. Continental dollars were at one point worthless, then exchanged for new currency at a rate of 1%, which led to Beadle's financial downfall. During the last year of his life, he seldom spoke to his wife or his 4 children. Meanwhile, he also developed a curious habit: he never slept without his axe and his carving knife. On December morning in 1783, Beadle killed his entire family and slit his own throat. It was the first documented mass murder-suicide in the history of the United States. Alexander White was a young Irish immigrant who came to America in the mid-1700s. He left his hometown of Tyrone on the Emerald Isle and landed in Boston. No sooner had he arrived than he fell in love with a local woman and proposed. As a new arrival, he had barely enough money to support himself, let alone afford to wed. He decided to solve that problem not through patience and hard work but through crime. He was working as a ship's mate aboard a cutter and tried to rob his captain when the ship was anchored in Cow Harbor on Long Island. The attempt went bad, however, and White killed the captain during a struggle. A passenger witnessed the dramatic event and dove off the ship before White could kill him. 2. The passenger then hurried to authorities and reported the crime. An arrest, trial, and conviction on charges of piracy and murder followed quickly. White was brought back to Massachusetts, where a jury sentenced him to death by hanging in 1784. Patience Boston was a Native American born in 1711 on an island off Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Her mother died when she was 3, and her father bonded her into servitude with the Crow family, where she learned to read and obey the word of Christ. Still, the family found her willful and defiant. She played on the Sabbath, told lies, and tried to burn down the house 3 times. As a teen, she went out at night, kept bad company, and followed lewd practices. When her term of service with the Crows came to an end, she married an African-American servant and became a servant to his master. A series of misadventures followed, involving depraved drunkenness, abuse of her husband, and adultery. A child was born but died in infancy. She said she was pregnant again, but the claim proved false. Her husband's master sold her to another man in Maine, who then sold her to another. There she had some groundless prejudice against this last master, and to punish him by killing his grandson, she pushed the boy down a well. Though I seemed to love him and he me, she said she was executed for the crime in 1735. Ethan Allen was a hero of the Revolutionary War and a politician. Speculator, the founder of Vermont, a philosopher and a self-taught theologian among many other things, he is best known for the taking of the British Fort Ticonderoga in 1775, a landmark battle in the Revolutionary War. He had gathered his troop of Green Mountain Boys before dawn but grew impatient while waiting for reinforcements, fearing he might lose the cover of darkness, so he rushed into battle even though he didn't have enough men behind him. Despite that hot-headedness, he forced the British to surrender. His account of his later imprisonment by the British was a seminal tract in the Revolutionary War, and he exploited that fame in his later political career, using self-aggrandizement to add to his wealth, and is now also seen as no less rapacious as his archenemies, the New York land barons of the Hudson and Mohawk valleys during the middle of the 18th century before the American Revolution. About 1 in 3 young women who went down the aisle to marry did so while pregnant. This information comes from court and parish records that have been preserved. This rate did not vary much from one colony to the next, whether it was Puritan New England, Quaker Philadelphia, or the sophisticated Charleston in England, aptly called the mother country. Almost half of its brides were pregnant when they got married. In colonial times, marriage was often viewed as a business. Arranged matches were commonly made based on the future husband's wealth, social status, and ability to generate income. The expectation was that love would come later if it ever came at all. Being married meant that both partners had responsibilities to each other and to the larger community. However, these societal attitudes often clashed with human emotions and natural desires. While formal courtship, engagement, and marriage were common, hormonal changes and close proximity often led people astray. Large American towns, particularly seaports, had thriving sex industries that added to the complexities of daily life and contributed to high rates of venereal disease from the pulpits. Preachers condemned sexual relations outside of marriage, warning against the consequences of such actions. Nevertheless, the promise of love and pleasure often outweighed the fear of punishment. People in colonial America often had misconceptions about sex shrouded in myths and false morality. Various customs and practices related to courtship and marriage reflected the social dynamics of the time. For instance, in some areas, couples would test drive a marriage by living together temporarily. This included sleeping together, often out of necessity during cold winter nights to ensure propriety. A board was sometimes placed between the couple in bed to prevent physical contact. Despite these precautions, it is easy to imagine how many courtships escalated, leading to hastened wedding dates. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. Remember to support, please subscribe.